I haven't done an Instagram Live for a while, and I thought it was important for us to understand what's going on in terms of how we recount our nation's history, with President Trump accusing the Smithsonian of focusing too much on how bad slavery was, and even threatening to cut federal funding, as he has with colleges and universities. And Doug, we did it.
Hey, how are you?
I'm great. Thank you so much for joining us. You know, you're, as always, when something historical is in the news, you're one of the first people I think of, Doug. And I'm always thinking, what would Doug Brinkley say about this? And obviously, Doug is a preeminent historian. And gosh, I don't even know how many books you've written, Doug. If I named them all, we wouldn't have time to have a conversation.
That's true.
So I think what I'm going to do is ask people to put any questions they might have in the question section. But it seems like President Trump is doubling down on really shaping how history is told and the narrative that exists currently in museums across the country, specifically the Smithsonian. He said yesterday that the Smithsonian, or was it yesterday? Yes, that the
Yeah.
Smithsonian was focusing too much on how bad slavery was, and is threatening to cut its federal funding. So I'm just curious. This has obviously been happening over the last few days. There's been an effort to reverse some of the progress, I would say, that had been made, for example, with Confederate statues and iconography in this country. And it's really part of a campaign to change course on how history is told. So what is your reaction to all of this, Doug?
Well, that President Trump is trying to whitewash history, and that he has a long narrative you can follow in his life of seeming to want to be hard on Black Americans. And this is something the Smithsonian does a remarkable job of explaining Black life. And it talks about everything. And yes, you can't do it without slavery. How could you study it? So there's a timeline if you go to the Smithsonian where they'll talk about slavery. You'll see shackles. You'll understand the horror of it. But that's also the triumphalism of the Civil War. They have at the Smithsonian, Harriet Tubman's hymn book, and then it follows Black, progress in their fun objects. They're from Muhammad Ali in boxing, or Chuck Berry's Red Cadillac, or Romaine Bearden's incredible Great Migration paintings. So it's the assault he's doing on the Smithsonian is just because he thinks turning the clock back to segregation of some kind is where America should be. And it's a sad day when a president of the United States can't zip it up, get off Truth Social, stop putting things in capital, and let professionals with the curators at the Smithsonian let them do their job. And you can have input, but you don't megaphone this kind of nonsense.
And what you're talking about is the Museum of African American History, which is a relatively new part of the Smithsonian. And it really is dedicated to telling the story, the often ignored story, I might add, of Black Americans and of slavery. And it seems to me that if he thinks this is being emphasized too much, it's almost as if he wants to rename and repopulate the Museum of African American History. As I said, I don't even know when it opened. Just a few years ago, I had the privilege of seeing it with my sister and my brother-in-law. It is a remarkable place, but I think people don't understand how for so long some of the uglier chapters of our nation's history were largely ignored when it comes to teaching history in schools.
I think a lot began when Ronald Reagan greenlit Martin Luther King Day as a holiday, and there became a new consciousness about Black history. It's been incredibly positive. People are learning about the genius of Frederick Douglass, or the agricultural work of George Washington Carver, the role of of women in the voting rights story of the 1960s. You know, people like Shirley Chisholm and others being kind of rediscovered. The good news is our America writ large isn't having a problem with this. Tulsa, Oklahoma recognizes the race riot that happened there in 1921. They're doing a reconciliation center and a museum, and it's part of the arts district, and it works well. You go down to Montgomery, Alabama, and they're grappling with their legacy in Alabama on race relations, slavery, and it's actually becoming a tourist draw. People are coming to learn more about it in Montgomery, in Birmingham, and Memphis. All of these incredible museums talking about the Middle Passage and slavery, and also what happened in Reconstruction and Jim Crow. But you get a liberating saga at the end with the Voting Rights and Civil Rights Acts of 64 and 65. But I would look at what President Trump's doing on the history of Black America. If you look at what he's doing in Washington, D.C. right now, it's because it's largely a Black city. It's a citadel of it. And, you know, the National Guard is going there right now. You know, they're there, they're controlling. It's part and parcel of a narrative of making Black people feel small, in my mind. And to do this at a time when you're trying to get to America 250 next July 4th, President Trump needs to pull the country together. And this sort of dynamic, what he does, is meant to pull us apart. That may have worked when he ran for president and won twice, but it doesn't work when you're doing America at 250 and you're just alienating Black Americans and turning the certain segment of white America against it. It's muddying waters that don't need muddied for no reason except Trump sees some kind of political anti-woke game.
As somebody who makes his living studying and writing about history, Doug, how important is it for a country to embrace its full history, not just the positive aspect and the achievements, which I do think are important. And I think maybe some critics are saying it's a question of emphasis, and we can talk about that in a moment. But how important is it for a country, a nation, to acknowledge its shortcomings and past mistakes? For example, I think about Germany and how forward thinking they are and how much the Holocaust is a part of elementary school education, how Holocaust memorials are all over Berlin and other places, and how critically important it is to embrace, as I said, the less attractive or the horrendous chapters of our past in order to move forward. Can you just talk from a historical perspective of a historian about that?
Yeah, great question, really. I mean, that's what defines the United States, our ability to learn from the past, to that arc of justice bending in the right direction. You know, history does not look well on certain presidents due to their race behavior. For example, Theodore Roosevelt was president and he invited Booker T. Washington to the White House and he paid Blacks in Washington the same as whites. Not a huge deal, but it was bending it in the future, getting better. Woodrow Wilson came in after TR and stripped away, fired really all Black federal workers, took away their equality. So it's retrograde. And what President Trump is doing is a retrograde of thinking about Black history. Maybe he feels Black Lives Matter went too far. Maybe he remembers Fred Trump and all of the racial battles he was in. I don't know what the trigger is. I think he thinks it works for him, but it's an awful thing to do to the country, to create and stoke this kind of argument for no real reason. They sent a hard letter, the White House, to the Smithsonian Lonnie Bunch that said, we want to relook stuff, then go relook it and talk about it. But instead, he's bully boying it on Truth Social instead of just having a conversation with professionals. And there's a limit to what this can do. To the statement he made about slavery is just it's nonsense. And yet, at best, it is just him saying something and not thinking, and at worst, it reeks of racism.
You know, speaking of statements, I would love for you to debunk the statement that Jillian Michaels, or at least contextualize it, that got a lot of attention when she was on CNN, where she said just 2% of white Americans own slaves. I think she is completely missing the point here, Doug.
I don't understand people that say things like that. I mean, our whole history is about the Civil War, and Abraham Lincoln is known as our great emancipator. You have Lincoln Memorial there in Washington, honoring him in his tomb in Illinois. Springfield is sacred grounds. It is the crucible of the United States. The Civil War. 800,000 people killed. The ravages of slavery kind of exposed. We fought all of that. So one needs to study it. Now, if it, like you said, Katie, there is such a thing as emphasis. And I always thought President Trump could come in and say, look, why aren't we talking more about Buffalo soldiers, who fought, or Tuskegee Air people? Or I want to look at a different side of Black culture, not just slavery, slavery, slavery. But he's not offering that. It's just a lot of negative putting down. And in fact, when Doge came in, they stripped Jackie Robinson off of the internet. Now that was, I think, a mistake that got put back. But why do that? Why constantly be mocking, belittling Black America? And it's because he wants to empower this sense of the white fantasy narrative of history. Now that I look, 1776 is huge. We should all talk about the founders. It is the beginning of our country. But we also have to talk about Jefferson as the slave owner and Washington, and what did it mean, and what are the differences? Why wouldn't we? Why wouldn't the Smithsonian grapple with that? Why would we sweep that under the rug? The danger becomes you become like Russia. You become like China, where you don't want true history. You want to kind of create a narrative that's based on your base, your 30% MAGA base. And look, the South is a great place. I was born in Georgia. I live in Texas. We're talking now. I taught in Louisiana for a long time. And most people in the South understand that's behind us. And I don't think it's right to belittle families because their great grandparents, served in the Confederate Army. That's not today's generation. And we do need to maintain our Confederate cemeteries with dignity. And we do have to teach what it was in the South that went on. But to attack that we don't like the way that you're explaining slavery, when it is what it is, one of the most horrific moments, times, decades, period in U.S. history, and we're still grappling with it today, the residual of enforced slavery.
Can you address directly this 2% notion?
Katie, I think that when we're looking at that 2%, she's talking about landowner, people that were plantation owners, people that there's only this group. And the truth is many white Southerners were poor. Many white Southerners weren't part of the slavery. They weren't benefiting from it. They were hard scrabbled people working off the land or working in a shop. They had to join and fight in the Civil War. And there's not, so I try not to dishonor families' heritage, but to say, it's just 2%, not that big a deal. We fought the Civil War over slavery. It's that simple. And if they're trying to say doesn't matter, then you're dealing with really uninformed people, and they really shouldn't be booked in my mind on any airwave if they're going to be doing that kind of destructive, fool's history.
Yeah, with all due respect, she is a fitness instructor and isn't a historian. And I think it fails to acknowledge the institutional damage and the institutional prevalence of slave owner or slavery writ large for the economy and for the people who enabled it and empowered it and embraced it. So I think when a small sliver rest without any kind of perspective or historical context, it's a really dangerous thing. Somebody was asking in the question section, Doug, does Donald Trump have the power I guess this is the question too about executive overreach and about Congress's responsibility for, for doling out the money to our institutions and to keep government running. Why does he unilaterally have the power to withhold federal funds from an institution like the Smithsonian?
Yes, he's looking, and his lawyers are looking for the power to. And with Trump and executive orders, you sign them every day as much as you can, hope that they stick. But a lot of it is sort of a smoke and mirrors game. He's wanting to stoke a controversy over the Smithsonian. He thinks it serves in his advantage. It's eating clock up on his side in between Alaska, Putin, Ukraine, and Jeffrey Epstein. He thinks it's a win for him. And what I would say is history will judge Trump a lot on how he pulls the country together, the United States, not red, blue, not a Democrat or Republican, for the 250th of our country. He has an opportunity. I've been careful not to criticize President Trump's idea of a garden of American heroes because it's hard. You pick 100 Americans, 200 Americans that should have a statue in the Black Hills. But I looked at the list, and there is Frederick Douglass on that list, and there is Harriet Tubman and Martin Luther King and Jackie Robinson. So even though it's something I think is unnecessary to do, I think they might want a Milton Friedman statue because he was a conservative economist, or William F. Buckley. It doesn't seem harmful, but what he's doing now with the Smithsonian at a time where he's shutting down Washington, restaurants are dying in DC right now. People don't want to go visit with their families because there seems to be this chaos going on in the street under the name of law and order. And at the same week you're doing that, beat up on the Smithsonian, which is the great magnet why people come to learn about America. In the end, it's anti-Washington, D.C. It's anti what he considers woke culture. And I would thought that he would know better, but he keeps doing it everywhere. And the Smithsonian seems to me a bridge too far because he's now starting to talk about how to stop making slavery seem bad. Are
In
you kidding
closing,
me?
I was going to ask you in closing, Doug, since you're a professor, curious feeling of how Donald Trump is treating universities and colleges across the country that have just pushed the president of the University of Virginia, and the Board of Visitors enabled that move. How do you feel about also all these colleges paying millions upon millions of dollars directly to, I guess, the Donald Trump library or whatever they're paying, whatever they're financing? I'm curious how you feel about that. And sorry, I think your Wi-Fi is a little spotty, but I can still I can still hear you. Okay, it's fine for everyone else, so never mind.
The DEI, a component of this second Trump administration, nobody's ever seen anything like it. It's the president of the United States interfering, in my view, with universities and academic protocol. I would do it as a case-by-case situation if there was something egregious taking on at Harvard or Columbia, but he's just targeting people. The University of Virginia made zero sense what they were doing there. The Charlottesville, Virginia does everything to honor Thomas Jefferson, who was a slave owner, and show the other side of Jefferson, the author of the Declaration of Independence and the founder of Virginia. This idea that University of Virginia is woke is just silly. Are there some professors they may feel this way about? Sure. But it's a university, it's a free place to speak. And I've never in my career, Katie, haven't encouraged conservatives to come to any campus. I think that may have been the liberal left trying to do what the right's suggesting, but doesn't mean you do it by you did that to us, we'll do this back to you kind of tit for tat. And to target a great school like the University of Virginia and just make everybody's year miserable, your alma mater, it's unnecessary. and it's eating up. We have so many problems to solve in this country instead of turning on each other on these fake woke issues that make if some things went too far, if the Trump people feel Black Lives Matter went too far, Me Too went too far, and now the pendulum goes in another direction. I mean, they're ripping it into a gutter direction instead of modifying, reforming something. It's just gutting and hitting our lowest common denominator kind of rhetoric coming out of the White House, and the whole world watches, the whole world listens, and Black America listens, and they feel sad that we're having a president that can't understand the plight of Black people in the United States, at least at some decent level, the way Republicans like Ronald Reagan or George W. Bush did.
Do you think, you said that historians will not look kindly on this. How do you think historians will write about this chapter in America?
Well, that we live in the age of Donald Trump, that the fact it's going to extraordinary political comebacks, that somebody with 34 felony counts, against him could come and win. It tells you some ineffectiveness that took place in the Biden years. But there is an exhaustion. The middle class America's tired. People are feeling left behind and ripped off. And there's been a fear of our country becoming a multiracial country. This idea of white power is fading, and it won't be able to hold up. But this is seen. I think Trump is like a last gasp effort to try to keep the whitening of America alive. It's more ferocious than people thought. It's Wolverine fierce out there right now, and Trump sees this as his way to be a historic figure who brought America back and wasn't getting rid of hyphens of Indian. Look what he said about Barack Obama, our first Black president. Wasn't born in America. He's a fake American. He attacked Kamala Harris. Is she Black or she's an Indian? She's not. Just going after people's heritage in a willy-nilly, ugly fashion. How does that ever look good? And tyrants fall in history. People that are authoritarians don't hold up well. Huey Long doesn't hold up well. Father Coughlin doesn't hold up well. George Wallace doesn't hold up well. So you have your moment, but there is a creator out there, and we have the longevity line. And at some point, we get sick and we get old, and we're left with the remnants of what our lives stood for. And I don't think. I don't go out there criticizing the tariffs of President Trump. I don't know enough about it. And he's showing a vision. He's trying to do it. But I can surely tell you the Smithsonian Institute has done nothing wrong by explaining in storyboards what happened in slavery to warrant being targeted by the President of the United States in an ugly, in your face way. It's unfair.
Unfair is probably putting it mildly, right? I mean,
Yes.
it is also just, some people would say disgraceful and uh, unnecessary and just gross. But anyway, Doug, Thank
On
you
that
so
note,
much for thank you so much for doing this. I just want people to know, and I hope that historians will band together and unite against this kind of selective memory that is being recommended. It's one thing to say, let's emphasize the positive also some more, but it's another thing to do the wholesale whitewashing of important and terrible chapters in our nation's history.
absolutely. And there's no such thing as America without Black America, whether it's in culinary or language or building or every field. They've been part of who America is. We're a country of omni Americans, but Black Americans have been here since the beginning, and I'm worried about it. I'm worried about this cynicism and bigotry as we're heading into America 250. We don't need any of that. And President Trump has shown times he could be a lot better than that. I'd stay out of this history game if I were him, but they won't listen to anything I say.
Well, I do. And Doug, I really appreciate your talking about this with us today. And I hope, as I said, historians of your stature come together and speak out against this or volunteer to be part of a review committee, and basically, give your opinion with a diverse group of historians to talk about why this is important and if other things need to be emphasized as well. So I also think that people, slavery wasn't one moment in time.
Right.
The systemic racism emanates from the institution of slavery. And as we know from the Jim Crow era and beyond, that slavery it didn't that racism and sort of the treatment of Black Americans and now people of color in general hasn't changed, and the remnants of racism continue to exist today, and that's why I think it's so important to learn and appreciate and understand the origins and how they reverberate in our modern society.
Yeah, true history is always more interesting than fantasy history of any kind. President Trump likes about fake news and well, there's fake history, and he's basically promoting fake history when he says that the Smithsonian is overplaying slavery and has to rewrite their storyboards or something because it wasn't that bad. I don't understand somebody who thinks like that.
Me neither. Doug, thank you.
Thank you. Bye, Katie.